Welcome, everybody. My name is Brian Kelly. I'm the editor and chief content officer of U.S. News and World Report. You may know us for our rankings of colleges and other things. We do not rank technology companies, but if we did, these guys would be in the top 10 without question. First, thank you for being here. I know these are the best students in the class because it's late in the day at the last day of the conference, and it's only the hardcore that shows up. So that's when the good stuff always comes out. We'll be giving out free stock tips, and actually free stock after this, won't we? I think that's a little secret for the last group that's here. Don't tell the others. Don't tweet anybody. So I'm going to do something that I never do here. I'm going to read the brief intro that the GSV folks wrote for this session because I think it's really pretty good. Sometimes they aren't, but that's a separate question. They're always good at GSV. As the plates have shifted, education and talent have become larger and more attractive markets for the major tech players. What does the activity of these players mean for a startup, for market growth, for product outcomes? How are they leveraging AI, personalization, AR/VR, neuroscience, et al.? And what are the key challenges and opportunities in this market? That's complicated, but this is an interesting, complicated panel. When they asked me if I would moderate this, as soon as I saw who was on it and what the topic was, I said, great, because this is really interesting. So there's a lot of talk that will overlap that we've had at this conference in the last few days about some of these issues, personalization, certainly, data, et cetera. But what we have here are 4 of the major players in the market, all moving up, assuming some different roles here, which they're all going to talk about, and doing it at a time when everybody is kind of grasping around to see whether we're maintaining scale, standardization, a number of these questions, new things happening on the technology side, and new things happening on the product side, and what does that mean for the little guys or the smaller guys, which I think is a key thing that we want to talk about here to sort of be inclusive of everybody. So the focus is on, in many ways, we want to try to keep the pitch on the future. What's next? And to do that, we have with us, I'll start here, John Couch, who's the Vice President of Education for Apple. And as I've been counseled in here, don't go into all of his biography because it's so long and you can read it in your text, but it's extraordinary and great. And John started that. And just as a quick sidelight, John's also writing a book. So, right, we're going to give you a chance to talk about that. He's going to pull all the pieces together for us. Mike King, Vice President of Education for IBM, also extensive career in education and IBM, and particularly with the Watson product, which we're going to talk about. Katie Blot, she's Chief Strategy Officer of Pearson. I'm sure everyone here is. I'm sorry.
That's
Blackboard.
all right.
Great.
Yeah, Tim's like, awesome.
You got 2 to 1.
I'm done here.
When I said this was the best students, it was not including myself. But I'm sorry, of Blackboard and Tim Bozik of actual Pearson. So, we couldn't have a better collection of folks to be talking about this with. So I want to start with Mike because Watson has come into the marketplace fairly recently in the fall. And as we'll see, Watson has not only made a big entry into the market, but is also, each of these 3 companies is working with IBM and Watson in different ways. So I think that's a good starting point to try to understand where are we going on the next steps here. So Mike, why don't you kick it off and tell us about Watson's role here?
Yeah, well, probably most folks remember when we introduced Watson on the Jeopardy! Game Show, and so we have been working on this for some time as an AI system using machine learning and big data and natural human interactions, dialogue, to solve particular business problems. So we've taken it from Jeopardy! We have begun to apply it into specific business domains, starting with healthcare as an example. And compared to a lot of other AI platforms, we really have focused Watson into diving deeply into industry problems. And we had a lot of conversations inside the company around the similarities between education and healthcare, and looking at the student, in the context of how you might look at a patient. And I also believe that, and you've seen this in the last year or so, a lot of concern about the impact of AI broadly on industries and on jobs and what that's going to mean for the future. And we've been talking about core principles of AI being purpose, being clear what it's doing, transparent about how it's doing it, the data it's using, and the third point has been skills. So we do believe that skills and education is going to be critically important over the next decade or 2, and so we launched a unit last fall to focus on education applications of Watson. and really to explore and develop the technologies to make it easier for Watson to be used in education to improve outcomes for students and engage across the classroom, across the campus, all the way out ultimately to careers, and provide the kind of input and value to the student, to instructors and others in education to get better outcomes, similar to what we've been doing in healthcare, where we're trying to help a physician with a diagnosis, with a treatment plan, looking at big data sets and be able to customize recommendations. So we're excited to work with some partners in that and really launching that as a new venture for us.
So John, Apple's been in this space a long time, and with both hardware and software, and you decided to do some work with IBM on this.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
Well, I think, prior to Apple, I was the CEO of a genomics company where we used technology to process the data in the human genome to find that unique protein for an individual DNA. I saw a very similar challenge in education, in that we can use technology, I call it precision pedagogy, to understand the gap in a student's knowledge map and deliver the appropriate learning activity to that student. So I think we can look at it all the way from the Watson environment into some of the larger school districts, but also in terms of some open platforms that address the same issues. We worked with a company called eSparks, which has vetted all the apps in the education apps in the App Store and looks at the results of the Northwest Educational Assessment Test and delivers to that student the appropriate app to help them overcome their gaps, and have seen test scores go from 29% to 68% in one semester by simply delivering exactly what that student needs. So I think, we're embarking, to me, that's the holy grail.
Yeah.
That's the big problem that we need to solve in education. Because if you look at a typical 5th grade class in Chicago, there's one student reading at the 1st grade level, one student reading at the 8th grade level. There's actually 6 different levels. And the amount of time that it would take a teacher to find the appropriate learning activity for those 6 different levels is more hours than there are in a week.
So there's when you say holy grail,
Personalization
is what you...
I use the term precision pedagogy.
Right. So, and so much of this is because of the volume of data now, right? Isn't that really one of the issues that Watson and others are able to create so much more data that you can make use of?
I think, there's data everywhere from, particular learning style or strength of an individual student, the content that they're trying to master. Yeah, there's quite a bit of data.
And more.
And I think the key is not to overwhelm the teacher.
Right. We want to come back to the teacher question. Katie, what does Watson do for Blackboard?
Yeah, Blackboard, we are very focused on student progression and persistence and success, and kind of getting them moving along their pathways, and all of the people along with the student who help them move along those pathways. And we're really excited about the partnership, and what we're doing together is marrying what we do at Blackboard is systems of engagement, right? So we have tools and services that interact with the student and somebody who's helping them, whether that's a faculty member or a coach or an advisor. And of course, with Watson, we have this tremendous capability around a system of insight, to your point of large data sets, where we can take this crazy amount of data that schools have about students and about what's happening, not just in their learning, but beyond that, and turn it into real insights that can be moved to action. And so what we're excited about is the ability to take those insights and deliver them right within the context of a workflow where somebody can do something about it. And so I think that's the other, it's maybe the fourth thing around, how you use AI and how you think about these is you have to contextualize them. So them sitting off in a system by themselves that somebody has to go to are probably not going to be acted upon. And we're seeing that with some of the kind of analytics work that's happening in education. And we're big believers that you have to deliver those insights into systems of engagements where they can be acted upon. So what we're doing with Watson or IBM and Blackboard together is looking really both within the classroom, less deeply around those learning moments. If I was at Pearson, I'd be talking about learning moments, and I know Tim will. But what we're looking at is what are those things that we know impact student progression and success that are also in addition to those learning moments, things like engagement in campus activities and institutional activities, and what are those things that span a multitude of courses and learning moments that the student needs to be aware of in order to continue to move forward, or somebody who's advising them needs to know. So we're really looking at, I would call it a concept of student engagement academically and co-curricularly, and how do we bring the Watson insights to the folks who can help students make good decisions moving along those pathways.
What does this look like, Katie? What is the interface that a student would be interacting with?
I think it's going to look like multiple different things, but one example would be a device. So we're looking at pulling Watson capabilities into, we have a BB Student app, so it's an app that students go to for their day-to-day. Again, highly contextualized. That's where I go to check my grades, see if I have a new assignment, maybe post a discussion board, interact with my learning. I might also then be experiencing there something that is using Watson Insights to surface to me opportunities I have for engagement and co-curricular activities that are very personalized to me. So we talk about, I like the concept of the pedagogy and the very focused pedagogy, but how do we turn these other things that are part of the business of being a student into a highly personalized, contextualized experience for people in somewhere that somebody could even potentially go to get help to figure out where they should go. You could see it as something like we do a lot of work with schools around student support services, which we know are absolutely critical for student success. So we also envision it being something as tactical but very meaningful as is my financial aid form in and processed, and is my financial aid been applied to my balance, or do I owe something and therefore I'm not going to be able to go to class next week because I have an outstanding balance.
When I went to school, Blackboard was something that had chalk on it, and
Right.
when I went to school,
Me too.
teachers used to throw chalk at you.
Yeah.
And you have to clean them if you were bad. You had to
Catholic
clean
schools
them.
in New York City, but one of the things that, from my experience of my own kids, was the great thing about Blackboard, I think, was the interface. That people became accustomed, acclimated to just using it.
Yes.
And as we move into a much more complicated phase with some of this, and I think to you, John, because you guys are in the interface business too in a big way. Does it get so complicated that kids can't use it?
I think that's the beauty of what we can do, which we have this tremendous amount of data, and one of the challenges, how do you surface it in ways that are highly accessible and don't muddy the experience? And that, to us, is what is so beyond what we're able to do with this data set, but Watson really can do is help filter it and help use it to create this personalized experience. So you don't have to throw everything at everybody. We can actually understand from what students are doing in their entire in the mass of their co-curricular activities and give them something very pointed. So we can have all this data, but we can still deliver them a highly contextualized, narrow set of maybe a nudge or maybe a recommendation for them, so it doesn't have to be muddy. And it's certainly something we spend a lot of time doing empathetic research with students and faculty and advisors, and we have clear conviction that you need a simple experience. You can't muddy that experience. And I think this actually helps us create a simpler experience as opposed to making it more complicated.
So I'm going to come back to John on that because I want to talk about the interface. But Tim, so you're also coming at this from a higher ed, more of a higher ed perspective on this. So how does Watson interact with what you guys are trying to accomplish?
So excited to tell you about our partnership and how Watson interacts with learning, which is sort of what Katie had referenced on, but also wanted to observe the discussion which is surfacing, the partnerships across, the partnerships we each have with IBM, which I think are increasingly going to be part of the sort of better digital future for education. And not just with the people on the stage, but with the startups and entrepreneurs that you mentioned. I know we're going to get to that later. So the partnership that we have with Watson, I actually think is more of a R&D partnership. So I think it's also one of the themes that is an important one, is in a sense, the application of science into technology and into learning. So we're working with the research unit as well as sort of from a technology standpoint to really understand the difference that Watson Dialogue might be able to make on the learner experience. So we're applying it in the cognitive tutoring capabilities in a dialogue experience with students that basically first gently and then more probably persuasively asserts itself to ask questions. And asking questions is a huge part from a learning perspective of how people, in fact, do learn. So it's using not just sort of the rank and recommendation capabilities that a lot of AI, machine learning, and Watson have, but to Katie's point, not only sort of contextualize, but very specifically with that student at that moment to engage a dialogue, because learning is about the changes that happen to the learner as a result of their interactions and being challenged. That's how they will grow. So it's early on. We're very excited about the direction and feedback we have of this is all very new, but of applying sort of a cognitive tutor into a learner experience that also has the characteristics of a better overall user experience that all of us aspire to, and I admire John's company for being a leader in setting a bar for what the kind of user experience we need to bring to digital learning experiences.
So let's talk about that. We have this possible holy grail here, but it's got to get used. It's got to get into the classroom, which means both students and teachers. So hold off on teachers for a moment, because that gets awfully complicated. But talk a little bit, John, about the Apple experience with interface, and how does something like this get into the student bloodstream, as it were?
Yeah, I think I've been working with a school and a software company in Mexico, Varmont School, and the Notion software company. They've built a pretty sophisticated classroom pedagogy that's relevant, that's creative, that's collaborative, that's challenging. And they've asked me to help bring that in the United States, and I don't think a frontal assault on our school system would be very successful. I was fortunate enough to run a K through 12 school for a number of years, and so I sat in the principal's desk, and I know what the day-by-day operations are, and that volume of change would be very difficult for, I think, our school systems. Right. So I think and I also believe that education is going to change top down. Not going to change top down. It's going to change bottom up. So I think Mike Markle used to use the analogy of how do you move a 20,000-pound marshmallow, which we could equate to our K-12 education system, and it's kind of like one bite at a time. So I really do think that we're going to need a platform. But I also believe that platform needs to be open and such that people can enter that platform to solve their short-term immediate needs, but grow with that platform over time. Because I think we could just overwhelm our K-12 institutions.
Yeah. The other thing I would add really quickly is I think one of the risks too is you could underwhelm people, right? We have all of this buzz and all of this interest in what these possibilities are, but as you just said, it needs to grow over time, right? And it needs to be able to ask questions and get smarter. And so one of the things we've been very focused on is how do you start in a way that kind of starts to get in the bloodstream, that delivers some value, but also sets the expectations with appropriate boundaries so that you don't disappoint right away, because that's another thing we know about students who are active consumers in our world today, is they're turned off by things very quickly if they don't work and if they expect them to do more than they can. So I think that there's that, both you can't overwhelm and you can't disappoint early. You've got to set those expectations, right?
No, this is a business-centric conference, so it's okay for us to talk about making money, right? So, or
well, we're giving out stock, right?
Making sales. Yeah. Right now, we're just going to talk about earning the revenue. So, Mike, tell me about how do you put this into the education system?
Well, I think, fortunately, we've been very fortunate with the partners we're working with that really have this deep domain expertise in the industry, that we can bring our research and our technology and partner up. And I'll just use the example when you're talking about experience. We worked a lot with Apple, and they taught us a lot about experience. We built an iOS app as part of kind of a front end to a Watson tool for school teachers. And it was interesting talking to a lot of teachers. We ran a lot of focus groups, and the overwhelming sentiment from teachers was a fear that data was going to be used against them. Mm-hmm. And I think, and I don't know if this is true globally, I haven't heard it as much, certainly in the United States, we kind of got off on the wrong foot with technology in schools, because it was a punitive tool to assess if schools were poorly performing or teachers poorly performing. So you now have this kind of culture where people are very hesitant to use anything that's data-centric or anything that reaches the technology. So we really, Apple helped design and build this app that puts Watson tools in the hands of the teacher. And it was just a Capel School District that's been trying it, and the feedback from the teachers was what was really compelling. They're using it to group teachers or group students into work groups and so forth, and there's the ability to have all this at their hands and be an immediate information they could use. We're really starting to see value around it, and so that was gratifying coming from focus groups that were going, are we doing the right thing here? To now hearing from teachers that it was very, very valuable. So I think from a business perspective, we've been very active philanthropically. We have our PTech program, our Pathway to Technology, is something our foundation's been doing. That's a 6-year program, high school, 2-year associate's degree, and we prepare students for a career in IT and offer to hire them at IBM when they finish. But the downside to philanthropy, as I say, is it doesn't scale. Philanthropists run out of money, and if the institutions don't have a budget or a business model behind it, they also can't scale it. So I hear a lot about these islands of excellence around this industry, and when you kind of back up, you see that, well, it was a great solution, perhaps, but there wasn't a business model behind it. So I don't think we apologize for viewing this as a business opportunity, because that's the way you're going to ultimately scale this.
Right, right. Tim, talk about in the higher ed sector. Is there more receptivity to these kind of products?
Look, I think so. I think that while it's a generalization, you have probably fewer of the sort of teacher concerns about data as sort of a tool that's judging them versus, the kind of analysis that can help them become even better teachers. You're still going to have a continuum of that in higher education, but I think the role of a higher ed faculty member is different than a school teacher from a number of aspects. I think digital is further along in higher education. You have more autonomy with higher education faculty generally than you do with teachers. And to some extent, I think you have the sort of confluence of some, not all, are researchers themselves. So the sort of appreciation for the application of sort of research into technology, into education, it's just a more natural climate for that to come about. So I think you have in higher education a market that is both more receptive and can sort of lead in the application of some of the kind of technologies that we're talking about. I mean, from the perspective of what we're doing with IBM, the business models, we're embedding this in digital products. The products are the platform to deliver the experiences to students. And we think that that can help not only deliver a better experience and outcomes, but actually expand the digital marketplace in higher education, meaning create better digital products that move us from a time when we might have published a book on neuroscience to the time when we're applying neuroscience in products that use partner experiences and help sort of move all this thing along.
Yeah. So each of the 4 of you have customers in this space. So I will invite you, you don't have to do this, but if you want to talk, give us some case studies of some of your customers, how they are implementing this and what we can learn from that.
Well, I can talk about a few of we have a lot of customers today that have built out basic student services with Watson. So replacing, maybe banks of phone agents or others, and where we've been able to answer simple questions like how do I get a parking pass, how do I get a flu shot, those kind of things. And that tends to be very idiosyncratic. So, with Tim and Pearson, physics is physics generally. Maybe Texas is an exception, but everywhere you go on the planet, it's somewhat productizable. But when you look at some of these other campus environments, campus questions, that's very unique. So I think there's a lot we've done. Deakin University is one of our first, Miami-Dade Community College. So there's a lot of institutions now that are starting to basically use the Watson technology in very unique ways on their campuses. So I think one of the things we hope to do with this effort too is to begin to build products that are, again, a lot more consumable and easily deployed on institutions. Mm-hmm.
Good. Anybody else want to compliment the customer? Tim, go.
Yeah, actually, I got 2 brief stories if I could. And I'm going to put them maybe in a to-from perspective because we haven't put Watson in the market yet, but I think Watson will be the future state of what we're doing. So first is I had a conversation with Professor Scott Hildreth, who teaches physics and astronomy at Chabot Community College in Oakland, California, sort of mainstream type of community college. Scott's a really good teacher, and he had actually piloted a predictive analytics function, which is sort of an algorithm-based approach to giving him some insight about his students, and had a cup of coffee with him recently when I was out in San Francisco, and what Scott told me is actually the predictive analytics were like raising a flag over a student's head when they otherwise might not be raising their hands, right? And how this very good teacher, I think, can become an even better teacher. So it's about scaling good teaching. And so I think, Watson capabilities will make more teachers or professors like Scott Hildreth even better by providing that kind of experience. And the other story is about, just a week ago, got an unsolicited letter from Shadi Room, a student in St. Petersburg College, in Florida. And he had just completed his nursing program at St. Peter's College and been admitted to University of South Florida in one of the sort of family nursing practice programs. But the gist of his letter was actually a thank you note. And the thank you note was first to amazing professors who he encountered. So teachers are always going to make a critical difference. But he also coupled that with actually the digital learning experience he had both in standard and online systems. And that gave him both better confidence and the ability to succeed. And sort of the close of his letter was to the effect of, in a sense, never stop trying to enable people like me to make more progress, right? With technology applied to better learning experiences, right? So to me, those are both indicators of receptivity, both from a student perspective and a teacher perspective, when we bring even more innovation, like Watson or AR, VR technology, whatever that might be, to the experience, are likely to make a difference.
John, talk about from the teacher perspective. We talked a little bit about that, trying to get teachers to adapt.
Well, we can talk a little bit about Capel because Capel is an Apple, pretty Apple district. They do a lot of our framework, which we call challenge-based learning, which is it's like project-based learning, but the students actually get to choose the project. So that there's groups of students. I'll give you one example. I was an 11th grade teacher. Jody Domheimer taught anatomy, and the students decided that they would like to write their own anatomy book and course and deliver that to youngsters in Africa. And so the teams formed, and the one young lady who was chose to do the illustrations probably wasn't thought very highly in terms of, one of the star students, but it turns out the project-based learning really allowed her to find her unique gift. Today she's a medical illustrator. So I think the COMPL is open to a new framework. Joe Ito, the Multimedia Lab, says education is what people do to us, and learning is what we do for ourselves. And so I'm hoping that these systems will really get us in the learning mode and not the education mode where everything it's about delivery and consumption of content rather than putting that content in a relevant, challenging context. Right. So I think it's just it's almost, I would almost consider it a little bit of an R&D, but actually in the field, because it is new and it's something that we're going to learn about. And I think the district that chose to work with IBM was probably one of our more advanced district in terms of moving forward with learning environments.
I mean, you have to do this a district at a time, right? That's the only way this works.
And I think
every long journey starts with a single step, right?
Right.
I think it's the most effective way you also drive then scaled adoption. What we've certainly found in the education space is nothing works better to get people to embrace a change, which is always hard, even if they know it's going to be better for them at the other side. It's work in between here and there, is hearing from peers and seeing data about how it worked, right? People who are teaching, people who are faculty are, for the most part, in it because they want to help people learn and progress. And so what we've found is you kind of have to do that R&D approach with a handful because you have to have, for the masses, something to show them of, look, this works. Because people are willing to do the time and embrace the fear of change if they feel like it's going to help their students on the other side.
Can I pick up on that?
Yeah.
So I think Katie's raising some really important points about recognizing sort of both the change hurdles and what can be done to help. I mean, we're talking about behavioral changes, right, of largely of teachers. But one is sort of having a more evidence-based approach. So having some use cases and having, I think, you get R&D approach on the front end, you have an evidence-based approach on the back end. And including really understanding not only what works, but under what conditions, right? Really understanding the kind of implementation requirements, because it's not the same in the different classrooms. You're working with a leading school district who has sort of the leadership ability to do that, but we can't be reliant on heroes, right? We can't be reliant on just individual teachers and districts who will push hard. We have to have, I think, instances to understand what works so more people can adopt and implement those kinds of, sort of effective learning experiences and teaching experiences.
Yeah.
And we have to work to me at two levels too, because there's the teachers and the faculty, and very much so I think both in K-12 and higher education, many of these solutions require institution level adoption and buy-in too. And so it's both at that faculty teacher level, but it's also what are we delivering? And it's one of the things we talk about a lot. There's things you're delivering to the student. How does that roll up into aggregate information that's also valuable to the institution and to that person who probably at the end is buying some of what you're selling and spending the money on it, and making sure, and they certainly don't want to do that if faculty or teachers are opposed to it, but the person writing the check is quite often the institution. And so how do you make sure that you're demonstrating value for them as well?
Yeah, John, you had a thought?
No, I was just going to, Apple did a 12-year longitudinal study on the impact of technology and learning called ACOT, and then we did ACOT 2, Apple's Classroom Tomorrow Today, which is where the challenge-based learning framework came from. And now we're involved in a $100 million program, 114 schools in 29 states, 96% free and reduced lunch. So to me, it's ACOT 3. And it's sort of the other extreme of the Koppel district. And I believe we're going to learn a lot about that too, because we're really talking about a very complex problem in a very large environment with people that are hesitant to change. In Apple, we have Apple University, we have a class on change, and we categorize people, and you have to manage all three types of people. Right. One are the swimmers. They'll jump immediately in on the new ideas. Then there's the shark spotters who want to wait to see if the swimmers are at risk, right? And then there's the tent pole hangers who are not going to move for anything, right? And
I like that.
We've got to manage all three of those types of people. And it seems to me, with even coming from the health industry and the computer industry, that we have a lot more tent pole hangers in education than in any other industry.
Yeah. So one of the things that we're hearing a lot here this week, and I hear it every time I turn around, is the whole skills gap notion and the frustration that you hear from the corporate sector of the education system is just not delivering. And many companies, in fact, looking for workarounds, looking for ways that people can gain skills and credentials, et cetera. So I'd like to hear from the four of you how the work that you're doing tries to address that circumstance or not.
Well, I published a paper beginning of the year with our Institute for Business Value. We surveyed about 6,000 people around the globe and persistently found across academia and industry this skill gap, a big concern around it. Kind of things we highlighted in that was the need to begin to build ecosystems and how do you connect with both schools, higher education, and workforce more effectively. Yeah. Our P-TECH model is something we're trying to use as a showcase for doing that. But ultimately, one of the things I tell educators is that gap is just going to get worse. That AI is not, we're trying to bring it to education to help personalize instruction and get better outcomes. But ultimately, the gap is going to be as AI works its way across our economy, so many jobs are going to be impacted by that. And I use the example of airline pilots, which today have very automated work today. And I use the example of two pilots. One, Sully, you know the movie. The guy lost 2 engines and landed in the Hudson River. Never been simulated. He was a white-haired pilot that knew how to fly a plane. The other example was Air France 447, which crashed going from Rio to Paris. And the sensor froze over, and a 25-year-old co-pilot just pulled back the stick and stalled the plane because he didn't know how to fly a plane. Just didn't have that seat of the pants flying. Mm-hmm. And the thing that struck me, though, in a Vanity Fair article I read on that flight was that the captain of that jetliner had only had 4 hours of actual hands-on-stick flying experience the prior 12 months. Everything else was simulated or is being done by the autopilot. And as we think about tools like Watson or whatever they might be, begin to permeate physicians' lives, lawyers, so many other professions today, how do we build and maintain expertise? And so I think it's imperative to begin to build a framework to personalize instruction. When I hear things about lifelong learning, to me, that's going to be a very different experience than what we've seen in the last 50 years in learning. It's going to be AR, VR, going to have a lot more simulation, game-based activities, and it is going to have to be lifelong because we have to build and maintain that expertise in the workforce, and that's something that educators have to start thinking about today.
Yeah. If I could pick up on a couple of points that Mike raised. The first is I think that ecosystem also includes state governors. I think a lot of those sort of the skills gap work will be driven at a state level where there are sort of specific skills gaps and sort of the ability to organize sort of the identification of those gaps and what you can do about them, and then decide how you can sort of deliver or start to develop those skills and sort of largely, but not entirely, resting on sort of the higher education systems as part of that solution. The second part of that is completely agree that the nature of work and the nature of skills to deliver that work will continue to change. There will be more, however we might interpret the lifelong learning, there'll be more, I think, individual accountability to take care of that. And I think it will end up developing in a number of different pathways that are less institutionally dependent, but not excluding institutions for delivery of however you might educate yourself or take any combination of sort of credentials, short courses, badges. I do think that will materialize as part of sort of the future of work and the future of lifelong learning to prepare people for that.
And the platforms we're talking about here could give people that information. Is that what we're talking about, right?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest gaps we have right now is probably in coding. Universities are producing about 10% of the coding needs in the United States.
Right.
And what we're starting to see now with Swift and other environments is that being pushed down into middle school. Right. The school that I mentioned in Mexico teaches programming, coding in the first grade. All right, and so, I'm not sure what most of the jobs are going to be in 10 years, but I think the piece that I think that's missing, and I put 4 kids through college and I have 15 grandkids, so I have my own petri dish. And my son dropped out of school because, and I learned later that he was a visual kinetic learner who thought in 3D. Well, if you want to think about an impedance mismatch in the classroom with somebody who thinks in 3D, and what we do in the classroom in terms of just memorize this, memorize that. Eventually, he was able to go back to school, graduate with honors, and just won the Dwell Award for his house design as an architect. But the technology caught up with him because he doesn't do anything in 2D.
Right.
He goes directly from his mind.
But that's
to 3D.
A great example of it's all about we can change the experience.
And we have to recognize it. That's the key, I think, and some of the platforms that we're talking about today hopefully will help us recognize that unique talent and unique gift that the students have. There was no class in medical illustration, right? And for that young girl. And I think there's a lot of people that fit into that category.
Right, and deliver different experiences for them. Yeah, and I think if we go far out, so certainly the things we're talking about and we're going to be doing together from a near-term perspective, very focused on how do you help both the student discover and identify passions and interests that align to career, to put them on the right academic pathway, to progress and to understand what capabilities and competencies and skills they need to be placed and be ready for the career they want. But I think if I think we're thinking future, to me what's very interesting, and we work with a couple hundred corporate clients doing corporate learning and talking with them about what are these skills that you need today. And we hear a lot less about the hard skills, and we hear a lot more about whatever you want to call them, executive functioning skills, soft skills, and this growing recognition that what is very important is developing people who can be lifelong learners. Concepts like cognitive agility. I know what I need. I know that I need somebody who can code this for the next 3 years, but if I want to have somebody for 15 years, what I know is that they need to be able to learn new things every couple of years, and they need to be able to do that pretty quickly. And that's where I think we've got some really powerful potential that we don't understand exactly how it could work yet with AI of can we start to test and push concepts like cognitive agility in a scaled way that are very, very hard to even understand where somebody is in a spectrum of that. So when I think 5, 10 years out, I get really excited about that potential.
So if Blackboard had been around, say, 50 years ago, they would have given me an assessment and said, you really shouldn't go into journalism. You're just not suited for this. You should go into coding.
We might nudge you and say, you're not doing so great in these courses. Aligned to your major.
Could Blackboard have told me that print newspapers was a bad business?
We might not have known that.
That's real intelligence. All right. I want to, a couple of you guys have touched on the international aspect of this, and I know you all have experience there. And what can we learn from, what's the adaptation we're seeing internationally, and can we learn something from that?
From my perspective, I think the same challenges that we have in K-12 education we have internationally. I mean, there's, as Mike said, there's pockets of excellence, and the revolution has started, but it's not equally distributed.
Right.
And so I do a lot of speaking internationally with ministers of education, meetings, conferences, and such. And I think we're all struggling, number one, to identify the uniqueness and the genius of each student, and hopefully, encourage them so that instead of pushing the education ball up the hill, they can chase it down the hill for the rest of their life. And this question of personalized learning or precision pedagogy. You know, Dr. Rose says, you know, we can't reduce a person to a single score. And yet that we continue to do that. I'm working with Dr. Goldfarb at the Johns Hopkins Medical School, and his task now is to redo the whole admissions test, because looking at a GMAT score is not necessarily make for a great doctor.
Right. The way a college diploma now is less making for a great employee sometimes. Yeah, I think some of the exciting lessons go to your last question about career readiness. We are certainly learning a lot in that regard from both places where economies have already started to shift very materially, places like the Middle East that are moving off an oil economy and recognized, 8-10 years ago that they needed significantly different skill sets, and have actually been pushing those into curricular changes at the post-secondary level. Places like Australia, who have combined and smaller economies where they're competing kind of at least globally in a local, Asia-Pacific area more than we have to. And so there, I think, are some very interesting lessons there about how people are pushing more radical curricular changes in order to make for workforce alignment.
Yeah.
So if I could add a couple of comments. I think a lot of the issues, there are a lot of similar issues that have been described from an international or global perspective. I think the additional ones I would add is, I think it's going to force us to understand how to operate under the constraints of sort of ability to pay. I do think there's potential for sort of scale that can provide a level of sort of quality that's technology enabled at the price points that a lot of the emerging markets where the demand is the largest is growing. So I think that's a very interesting challenge for all of us. To Katie's point, I think, I'll talk specifically about sort of higher education. People can debate the numbers, but we expect the global higher education system, which there's not, but there's between 150 and 180 million people in higher education today. People expect the number to go up by at least 50 million over the next 10 years, right? That's a significant expansion of demand for which there isn't sufficient quality capacity on the supply side. So I think the kinds of things that we're talking about are absolutely essential, and most of that demand are going to be first generation higher education, will be very sort of workforce driven, right? It's not, there'll be people who will have aspirations and access to elite education, but a lot of it's going to be about education to get a better job and a better future. So I actually think you're going to see the phenomena of more workforce-led higher education delivered in more sort of virtual digital blended models that take advantage of the kind of both R&D and capabilities that we're all talking about. And I think, by having a global ecosystem around that, I think there's an enormous amount of learnings that could come back from markets and customer segments that we can then apply in a very virtuous cycle.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's all about scale and how do we start to scale this up.
Right.
And I think one of the things that there are opportunities around the world, and we've started to have these discussions in the U.S. How do you begin to look at this more as a seamless experience for the student? And again, the great idea with P-TECH is if you can give a student an aspiration and a clear pathway on it, how to achieve it, they will do that. And they will cross institutional boundaries on that pathway. And I think we have a traditional educational system that's kind of segmented, and we lose a lot of people in the cracks, if you will. And I think we've got to begin to look at it a lot more seamlessly, and hopefully technology can help do that.
I heard a really interesting talk by Jeff Salingo yesterday of Arizona State. He was talking about sort of the concept of the networked university or university alliance. It's not necessarily a new concept, but that we need universities to promote more sort of cross-recognition of courses so they can expand their access, whether that's within the U.S. or on a global basis. I think that kind of thinking and sort of educator networks, university networks are essential, as well as the kind of networks we're talking about coming out of the private sector to sort of promote that kind of scale.
Right. P-TECH, in the case of P-TECH, Mike, I mean, one of the keys there, I think, is it has corporate buy-in, right? So you're making that connection between the school and the job market. But catch us up on that, because I remember when there were 2 P-TECHs, but it's
we
really
have
grown.
well over 100 today, so, and we've got other companies that are starting to sponsor the program. So it's kind of a playbook that's available to anyone that will help reshape the curriculum to STEM focus. Right. I really love the challenge-based stuff, by the way, that Apple's doing. It was exciting to see it compel in action. But the idea is to get students more immersed in STEM and give them a high school diploma as well as an associate's degree. Right. And then position them for employment at IBM and we interview them. We've got other employers doing this as well. But it comes back to the idea of how do you give them a clear aspiration and a pathway to follow it. But again, if we can do that through technology and make it scalable, I'd love to have every kid have the option to explore and create that aspiration and figure out how to follow it.
So we sort of started with that notion that because we have 4 big players in this space and there's some continuity and some standardization, are we getting to scale? And then the other side of the coin, what does that mean for the smaller players in the audience? So let me turn back to that notion. I don't know how anybody feels here. Is anybody like really discouraged that these guys are just going to eat your lunch and there's nothing left to do anymore? They said the tectonic plates are shifting, which means maybe somebody falls in. But give us your thoughts on if you're just go right down the road. Give us your thoughts on what are the opportunities here for other folks, investors and entrepreneurs.
Yeah, first and foremost, I don't think I have a monopoly on creativity. So I'm hoping that the platform, the pedagogical infrastructure that we build is an open infrastructure so that creative people can add value to it. I think that's always been part of our philosophy. And so I do, I see tremendous opportunity for startups to just sort of take the smaller bite out of the marshmallow and keep it moving.
I like that marshmallow. Mike, what are you?
I think it's really just opening up more and more opportunity. And we talked about AR, VR. I mean, there's going to be more and more depth to the learner experience in the future. More personalization. That means more opportunities to create tools and experiences that are personalized to unique individuals. We're really trying to build this on open standards. I've been involved in the IMS standards organization now for 15 years, I think. Really promoting this idea of interoperability so that we create this open ecosystem so that you can mix and match and bring customized tools to the individual when and where you need it. So I think what we're trying to do is help harness that big data with an underlying AI tool to drive those insights, to drive the engagements, but ultimately it's opening up, I think, a very, very broad ecosystem for a lot of players.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, and I think I'm actually the small person, the small guy on the stage. But I think that also when kind of larger players get in and start to move to scale, it starts to legitimize the use of technology and data and new things, especially when we're talking about new types of technology, which is really helpful for everyone. But I see it just opening up a tremendous amount of space because if we're very frank up here as the big players, we are going for scale and we're going to cover a wide part, a global higher education market or a 50-state K-12 market. And I think that leaves a lot of room for, you heard everybody talk about personalized and contextualized. Things need to be different. They need to be different by discipline or subject. They might need to be different by communal area or type of K-12 district. And so that, I think, leaves a lot of space for things that the big players might not go that deep for a particular segment of the market, where an innovative player really can create something special and deeper than a broad platform player might.
All right, good. Yeah.
Yeah, so I share the same sentiments about that, about innovation is going to come from multiple sources. Open standards will help promote that. Larger players can sort of create some scale around that, but certainly the experience and impact on learner outcomes will be enhanced by a lot of other innovations. The other thing that I'd maybe add to that from sort of more from a Pearson's perspective, which is about sort of teaching and learning, is to some extent, we recognize that we deal with a lot of different teachers and educators today. And even from a higher education standpoint, we source the best ideas about teaching and learning and try to, it used to be to find authors who could create content, but now it's a number of people who are partners in what contributes to better education. Then part of what we do is try to turn those into a useful and a great experience, right, that delivers these kind of things. So we're quite used to working with a number of what might be thought of as individuals from a product development perspective. Just the nature of how we do product development is changing. That very much includes startups, entrepreneurs, as well as large-scale delivery players that we can learn from. So I think that's a natural progression from how we view product development from an education perspective.
And I would just add, we have, last time I counted, well over 100 ed tech companies that are using the different Watson API services today to enhance their products in some way, speech to text and and personality and such other things. So.
All right, I'm relieved we didn't turn everybody off here. So I've tried to sell as much product as I can for you guys, but before we leave, I want to try to sell John's book. John, tell us very quickly, 'cause you've got it's a terrific theme. Just give us a quick summary of what you're going to be writing about.
It's called Rewiring Education, and I have a website called rewiringeducation.com for people to sign up and be notified when it's available. It's due to the publisher in June. It represents really almost 50 years of education from the time, my fellow students told me that I was synonymous with Aristotle because I kept memorizing everything, to getting into coding in 1976. But the basic premise is there's about 8 challenges, I think, that I was able to isolate. One of them is the assessment area, which we really didn't talk about. You hit on it a little bit, that if that teacher in that 5th grade class took that student who was reading at the 1st grade level to the 4th grade level, she would have been considered failure. Okay, and so we talk a little bit about raising the level of the teaching profession, the importance of professional development on an ongoing basis, like an accountant. We talk about changing the pedagogy in the classroom from memorization to more of a community-based challenge type of environment. I think the 10 universities in Brazil, that whole project has taught us a lot. We took 100 students in 10 universities and opened up a class on app development, which ended up turning out to be entrepreneurial development because the process to write an app is the same process to start a company. So it really just is a collection of that. The goal is to start a conversation. And I think Todd's book, new book, Dark Horse, and mine will kind of be out at the same time, and they're both geared to start a conversation. Let's get out of the, quote, education world and into the learning world.
That's great. Well, we'll look forward to that. Although if it's due June 1st, what are you doing here? I mean, deadlines. Deadlines. All right. So I would rank this one of the best audiences at GSV. You guys have been terrifically attentive, and I really appreciate that. I got to ask you to do one more thing before we go, which is to thank our terrific guests here for the insights.